If you told me one stupid traffic accident in the middle of corn harvest would end with an entire upscale neighborhood questioning everything their HOA had ever told them, I probably would have laughed, climbed back into my tractor, and gotten back to work, because that's what farmers do. We don't spend much time imagining courtroom battles or survey crews or television news vans parked outside our fields. We worry about rain, diesel prices, and whether the combine will survive one more season without another expensive repair. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm 48 years old, and my family has been farming outside Mason Grove, Illinois, for 3 generations. My grandfather bought this land after coming home from Korea. My father expanded it one field at a time, and somewhere along the way I learned that dirt has a memory. It remembers every tire track, every drought, every flood, every promise somebody makes about respecting another man's property. Looking back now, I think my grandfather would have seen this whole thing coming long before I did. Harvest season always starts before sunrise. There's something peaceful about watching the first orange light spill across rows of corn while the engine rumbles beneath you. The smell of diesel mixes with dry stalks. Coffee goes cold before you've taken 3 sips, and you settle into a rhythm that hasn't changed much in 50 years. Across the county road sat Silver Creek Estates, one of those neighborhoods with decorative stone entrances, matching mailboxes, perfectly trimmed lawns, and people who hired landscapers to mow grass smaller than my machine shed. We rarely crossed paths. They enjoyed quiet evenings around backyard fire pits while I was still greasing equipment after dark. Different worlds, separated by one road and a lifetime of perspective. Years ago, my father had leased a little over an acre near the southeast corner of our property to the neighborhood's utility district. It wasn't glamorous land, too wet to farm well, too uneven to build on. They used it as part of a permitted wastewater dispersal field, paid every year, and everyone minded their own business. Dad always said, as long as they honor the agreement, it's easy money. After he passed, I simply kept filing the checks without thinking much about it. That little patch of ground wasn't something I visited often, especially during harvest. My attention stayed on the fields that actually fed the family. Then came October 17th, the kind of afternoon where you're racing daylight because rain is coming tomorrow. I was driving my tractor through the county intersection, moving between fields with hazard lights flashing and every reflective sign shining bright enough for anyone paying attention. That's when a black luxury SUV came flying through the stop sign. I didn't even have time to swear before metal slammed into metal hard enough to shake my teeth. The impact shoved the front weights sideways. Hydraulic lines burst underneath me, and I watched green fluid spread across the pavement like somebody had dumped gallons of paint. I climbed down, expecting the driver to ask if I was all right. Instead, the woman jumped out already pointing at me. "Are you blind?" she screamed before I could open my mouth. "You people think tractors own the road." I remember blinking because she wasn't scared. She was furious, like I'd interrupted her afternoon rather than the other way around. She pulled out her phone almost immediately. "I'm calling the sheriff. You're paying for every scratch on my vehicle." I looked at the crushed front end of her SUV, then back at the untouched stop sign sitting 20 feet behind it, and honestly, I wondered if we had somehow witnessed 2 different accidents. "Ma'am," I said as calmly as I could manage, "I had the right of way." She laughed. Actually laughed. Good luck proving that. By the time Deputy Ryan Mercer arrived, she'd already told him I ran the intersection, claimed my tractor was speeding, and suggested I shouldn't even be allowed on public roads. Ryan had known me since high school. He didn't take my side because we were acquainted. He walked the scene like every professional should. He measured skid marks, checked vehicle positions, looked at the shattered debris field, then quietly walked over to the SUV and pointed toward the stop sign. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "did you stop before entering the intersection?" She hesitated just long enough to answer the question without speaking. 10 minutes later, she was holding a citation while glaring at me like I'd personally embarrassed her. As the tow truck loaded my damaged tractor onto a trailer, she walked past and muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "People like you always think land gives you power." I didn't answer because I was more worried about whether my transmission housing had cracked. Still, Those words stayed with me the entire drive home. That evening, I spread insurance paperwork across my kitchen table while my younger brother Noah helped estimate repair costs. Somewhere beneath maintenance records and fuel receipts sat an old manila folder I'd almost forgotten existed. The lease agreement, 25 years, signed by my father. I opened it mostly out of habit, expecting nothing more than another document to file away after the insurance claim. Instead, my eyes stopped cold on one line near the bottom of the final page. Expiration date, September 30th, just over 2 weeks earlier. I read it again, then a third time. Noah looked over my shoulder. "Didn't they renew that?" he asked. I slowly shook my head. I couldn't remember signing anything. I couldn't remember receiving anything. Outside my kitchen window, I could just barely see the lights from Silver Creek Estates glowing against the evening sky. And for the first time in years, I found myself wondering a question I probably should have asked the moment that agreement expired. If nobody had permission to be using that land anymore, exactly what was still running underneath it. The next morning, I called my attorney before I called my insurance company, and that probably tells you everything about where my instincts had landed overnight. Linda Brooks had handled property issues for farming families around Mason County for almost 30 years, the kind of lawyer who kept muddy boots behind her office door because she spent as much time walking fields as she did standing in court. When I slid the expired lease across her desk, she adjusted her glasses, read every page without saying a word, then finally looked up and asked the question that made my stomach tighten. "Has anyone signed an extension?" I told her no. "Any temporary operating agreement?" Another no. She leaned back and folded her hands. "Then they may have a serious problem if they're still occupying your property." Those words echoed in my head all the way back to the farm. I wasn't interested in picking a fight. Believe it or not, farmers usually avoid conflict because conflict wastes time, and time during harvest is worth more than almost anything. Still, I couldn't ignore what was sitting in black ink right in front of me. I drove out to the southeast corner that afternoon for the first time in months. The dispersal field looked exactly the way it always had. Grass swayed in the breeze, vent pipes stuck out of the ground every so often, and nothing seemed unusual. But once you start looking for something, your eyes notice details they'd ignored for years. There were newer access covers than I remembered. Fresh gravel near one service box. Tire tracks from utility trucks that hadn't been there the previous season. I took photographs anyway and called a licensed survey company. If everything was legal, great. I'd renew the agreement or negotiate a new one and move on. If something wasn't legal, I wanted facts instead of assumptions. 3 surveyors arrived 2 days later carrying GPS equipment that looked like it belonged on a NASA mission rather than in a soybean field. Their crew chief, Mark Ellison, had worked hundreds of agricultural boundary cases. By lunchtime, he'd already confirmed every property pin matched my deed. Nothing surprising there. The second day, they mapped the entire leased parcel, comparing modern coordinates with easement records from the county archive. Again, everything lined up. I was beginning to think I'd wasted money chasing a feeling when Mark called me over near the eastern edge of the property late on the third afternoon. He was staring at a screen mounted on a cart equipped with ground-penetrating radar. "Mr. Caldwell," he said carefully, "can you explain this line?" I looked at the display. Even I could tell something wasn't right. One pipeline matched the recorded utility easement exactly. Another line, deeper and running diagonally across nearly 150 feet of my property, wasn't anywhere near the documented route. "What am I looking at?" I asked. Mark zoomed in. "You're looking at a second buried pipe." I frowned. "Maybe an old drain tile?" He slowly shook his head. "Too large, too straight, and it's PVC, not clay." That answer changed everything. Linda immediately requested utility maps from the county planning office. We checked environmental permits, construction records, easement filings, engineering plans, archived subdivision approvals, even old zoning amendments. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. Only one wastewater line had ever been approved. The second one simply didn't exist on paper. It was as if someone had buried it and hoped nobody would ever ask questions. Linda recommended hiring an excavation contractor to expose a short section for identification. We obtained every required notice, informed the utility locator service, scheduled county inspectors, and documented the entire process. Nobody could later claim we acted recklessly. The morning excavation began. I barely slept. Excavators always make farmers nervous because digging into the ground means surprises, and surprises usually cost money. The operator peeled back layers of topsoil with incredible precision until orange clay appeared beneath the darker surface. Another foot down, the bucket stopped. Everyone climbed into the trench. There was bright, white 8-inch PVC pipe, cleaner than the original infrastructure nearby. Mark brushed dirt away from one coupling and pointed silently. Molded into the plastic were 4 unmistakable numbers. 2010. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, Linda exhaled. Well, now we know when it was installed. The county inspector took photographs from every angle while I stood there trying to understand what I was seeing. Somebody had built an entirely new wastewater line across my farm roughly 15 years earlier without asking permission, without recording an easement, and apparently without updating a single public record. The question wasn't whether it existed anymore. The question was who approved it. Linda submitted formal requests for HOA board minutes going back 15 years. Most records had been preserved electronically. After several days of digging through meeting packets and contractor invoices, a picture slowly emerged. During a neighborhood expansion around 2010, additional homes had overloaded the original wastewater system. Instead of renegotiating land rights with my father, who had been battling cancer at the time, someone apparently authorized a contractor to reroute part of the infrastructure through private farmland during a larger construction project. There was plenty of discussion about reducing costs, plenty of references to field modifications, plenty of invoices, but nowhere could we find a signed agreement from my family. It was like reading a mystery novel where somebody had ripped out the final chapter. Linda drafted a formal notice to the HOA requesting an immediate meeting. We weren't threatening anyone. We simply explained that an undocumented utility line had been discovered crossing private property and requested they contact us within 10 business days to discuss a lawful resolution. For days later, their attorney responded with one paragraph that still makes me laugh whenever I think about it. The existing infrastructure has served the community uninterrupted for many years and is presumed acceptable under established use. Linda read it twice before sliding the letter across her desk toward me. Notice what they didn't say. I scanned it again. They never claimed ownership, never referenced an easement, never attached a permit, never denied the pipeline existed. They just suggested time alone somehow erase property rights. That answer bothered me more than an outright denial would have. A week earlier, I probably would have accepted almost any reasonable compromise. After reading that letter, something inside me shifted. My father spent his entire life teaching me that a handshake mattered because your word mattered. If you wanted to use another man's land, you asked. If circumstances changed, you sat down and negotiated. You didn't quietly bury millions of dollars worth of infrastructure beneath someone else's field and hope the paperwork disappeared with time. Linda looked at me across the conference table and spoke carefully, almost like she was testing whether I truly understood the weight of what came next. Ethan, under state law, you have options. But whatever you choose must be done carefully, legally, and with complete documentation. I nodded. I don't want revenge. She smiled faintly. Good. I looked back at the photographs spread across the table, at the date stamped into that white PVC coupling, then out her office window, toward miles of harvested fields turning gold beneath the afternoon sun. I just want my property treated like it belongs to someone. That was the moment we stopped preparing for a conversation and started preparing for a legal exercise of rights that nobody inside Silver Creek Estates seemed to believe I actually had. Linda insisted that every single step be documented before anyone touched a shovel. So over the next several days, we notified the appropriate agencies, marked every utility, hired a licensed excavation contractor, and even invited the county inspector to observe the work. There was no drama that morning, at least not at first. The sky was gray. The wind carried that familiar smell of cut corn across the fields, and the excavator peeled away the soil one careful bucket at a time, until both wastewater lines sat exposed inside the trench. One belonged exactly where the recorded easement said it should. The other crossed my property with no recorded right to be there. Linda looked at me and simply nodded. "It's your land." I gave the contractor permission to disconnect only the unauthorized section that crossed my property. Then both exposed ends were professionally sealed and documented. We left everything exactly as the law required. Less than 2 days later, my phone started ringing. First came rumors from neighbors, then local reporters asking questions. Then the county health department confirmed what everyone feared. The unauthorized line had been serving a large portion of Silver Creek estates for years, and without it the system immediately began failing. Emergency crews were everywhere. Residents were angry, confused, and demanding answers from the HOA board that had repeatedly assured them everything had always been properly permitted. What surprised me most wasn't the chaos. It was how quickly the truth spread once people started asking for paperwork instead of promises. Homeowners requested records. Contractors were questioned. Former board members suddenly stopped returning calls. Within a week, the entire HOA leadership resigned under pressure, insisting they had inherited decisions made years earlier. Maybe that was true for some of them. Maybe it wasn't. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that none of them could produce a single document giving them permission to use my family's property. 3 days later, a newly elected HOA president knocked on my front door. His name was Daniel Foster, and unlike the people before him, he arrived without threats, without cameras, and without an attorney trying to intimidate anyone. He took off his cap before speaking. "Mr. Caldwell," he said quietly, "we're here to fix this if you'll let us." That sentence alone changed the entire conversation. We sat around my kitchen table for nearly 4 hours. Linda represented me. The HOA brought legitimate engineers. And for the first time, everyone focused on solving the problem instead of protecting egos. Their engineer admitted relocating the system would cost even more than purchasing the necessary property rights outright. Linda slid one proposal across the table. It included a permanent purchase of the affected acreage, properly engineered easements for future maintenance, environmental liability transferred away from my family forever, restoration requirements, annual inspection obligations, and enough compensation to reflect the true long-term value of what had been taken for granted. There was silence while everyone read the numbers. Finally, Daniel looked up. "It's expensive." Linda answered before I could. "So is 15 years of unauthorized use." Nobody argued after that. By the end of the week, the agreement was signed, funds were transferred, and the county recorded every document the way it should have been done from the beginning. Construction crews rebuilt the connection legally. Inspectors approved the work, and life slowly returned to normal. As for the woman who hit my tractor, I only saw her one last time. She was loading moving boxes into a rental truck while a for sale sign stood in front of her house. She glanced across the road, recognized me, then looked away without saying a word. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I didn't feel victorious either. Mostly I felt relieved that something my father had worked his entire life to protect was finally being respected again. Every fall when harvest season comes around, I still drive past that same intersection, and every time I do, I remember how close I came to filing away one expired lease without reading the last page. Funny how life works sometimes. The biggest turning points don't arrive with dramatic music or flashing lights. Sometimes they begin with a forgotten document sitting in an old manila folder and one simple decision to ask, does this still belong here? So now I'm curious what you think. If you discovered someone had quietly been using your property for years without your permission, would you have negotiated first, or would you have immediately enforced your rights? Let me know down in the comments, because I genuinely want to hear where you draw the line between being a good neighbor and standing your ground. And if you enjoy stories about property disputes, small-town justice, and ordinary people refusing to be pushed around, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.